Explore the history, relationships, expertise, and data that go into ensuring Stine growers get maximum yield potential. This is the Stine Seedcast. Here's your host, David Thompson.
Hello, and welcome to the Stine Seedcast. I'm your host, David Thompson, National Marketing and Sales Director for Stine Seed Company. We've got another great episode lined up with special guests, expert insights, and discussion on everything you need to know about maximizing yield potential. On today's episode, our special guest is Myron Stine, President of Stine Seed Company. Welcome back to the show, Myron.
Thank you, David. Glad to be here.
So lately, there's a lot of hype in the industry about short-stature corn. We're seeing more and more seed companies talking about the benefits of shorter plant architecture, including standability, overall performance, and more companies coming out with their own iterations of the product. Now, Stine has been on the forefront of short-stature corn for more than a decade. So I've asked Myron to come on here to talk about the short corn revolution that we're seeing and what that means for Stine's advantage in the marketplace. So let's get started. So to get us started today, Myron, how about a quick refresher? Tell us about Stine's journey in moving toward shorter stature corn, how we started.
You know, this is a really good topic because it'll explain how we've become a company with very, very different material. So Harry Stine, when we started breeding corn, would put out plots, just like on our soybean program. He'd make a number of new genetic combinations, put plots out all over, and then take the yield information off of those and decide, okay, what's good and what's bad. And at that time, and this was in the 70s and 80s, late 70s and 80s, most companies would plant their replicated plots and they'd thin them out to a specific population. We didn't do that, or he didn't do that, because that was an expensive process. So what he would do is he'd have the plot planted. It would not be thinned out. And so everything in that plot would sometimes have a different finished population when it came up. And he went years doing that. And he would always pick, of course, the highest yielding material. Well, that just happened to be the material that typically had more plants out there. So he did that for years. Eventually he got the germplasm bank refined to this unique set of genetics. And then in the mid-90s, we began to start to pay attention to plant heights and record those and track those very, very well. And we do that relative to the competition. So we'd put a number of products the competition had in our trials and then have our stuff in there, of course. And we began to see that, oh my gosh, you know, our material is way shorter, like substantially shorter than the competition's. And we even watched one particular competing breeding program that we saw their material getting shorter also, not as quickly as ours, but it was getting shorter. Then we saw another company that actually their material was getting taller. And we tell you that that's because if you have the proper selection criteria in your program, and you're eliminating shading effect as a factor on selecting for genetics in a replicated plot study, that you begin to select shorter plant types. The corn plant wants to get shorter and wants to be at higher populations also to be a higher yielding hybrid.
So in a way, this whole thing started, if I'm hearing you, because all the research work that was done early on was about how many plots can you do, right? I mean, how many effective plots can you do?
Exactly.
And that's always a trade-off between the amount of work required per plot,
yep,
and the number of plots you can do. So we decided not to hand thin the plots and in an effort to do more plots, to get more data.
Yep.
And then over the years of doing that, we found a pool of material that's adept at being planted at higher population. We probably got rid of some stuff that was maybe worse on standability because you're exposing it to that in its real world environment, and probably didn't even know we were doing it at the time, right?
Yeah, it was really dumb luck. I mean, so my father, Harry, is a genius when it comes down to understanding how many plots he needed and the cost of that and how to be as efficient as possible. And in doing so, he eliminated a couple steps that a lot of companies were doing at the time, but that helped him refine this germplasm bank to what it is today.
Well, and I think I've heard Harry say in the past too, so all the gains we made up until just a few years ago were almost entirely by accident because nobody really fully understood this trend. And then you think of that, okay, now if we know what we're shooting for, think of how productive we can be now that we know where this path is going. So that's kind of exciting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so then by the mid-90s, we began to understand, okay, these shorter plant types is where it's going. We need to find genetics that yield under higher populations, that stand under higher populations. That's the future. So if we want to create the future product for our customer, we have to be way ahead of the curve on, we're going to be at populations that are unheard of for the typical farmer. Yeah,
exactly. And so we've been on this path, as you said, since really, as far back as probably the 1980s, whether we knew it or not, this whole thing was kind of evolving. But as I said, it seems like lately every magazine I open, everything we talk about lately on corn seems to be about shorter stature corn. So why all the conversation now if we've been talking about it for a long, long time?
Well, I would tell you that, we figured out that's how you get more yield out of corn. And frankly, you can just look at history and you can see how planting populations have increased since hybrid corn was started, and row widths have gone down. Mm-hmm. So it's plain and simple to see that the future of corn will be higher populations, and probably to get those higher populations, you will need a shorter statured plant. And also happens to be that with a shorter statured plant, that opens up a number of management practices that can be done, with putting on a fungicide and herbicides and things of that nature with more conventional type spray rigs versus, flying it on tall hybrids.
Again, it seems to me like suddenly it's become a topic that's in vogue. I mean, in your opinion, why has it become a popular topic?
Well, because the other breeding companies understand that's the direction their corn will need to go for the future.
So everybody getting on the bandwagon all of a sudden is leading to that conversation.
Right.
I guess the question I'd have is again, we've been on this path for a really long time. What has, in your opinion, what's changed about the line of thinking, among the industry that suddenly everyone seems to get it?
Well, so for the last 15 years, we've been talking about more plants per acre, make more yield, shorter plant types. The other companies are now, if you listen to them, they have the same exact information out. They're talking about the history of plant populations, so on and so forth. So they've figured out that's what will need to happen to have these better yields. I also think that with some companies, they have had a lot of issues with weather. If you look at our lineup, because it's shorter stature material, we typically do very, very well with wind events and anything that hurts standability in general. And our competitors have always struggled with that, and sometimes that can be disastrous. And so I think they understand going down the road here, if they have material that's handling weather events better than what they have today, they're going to be ahead.
Again, we're talking kind of about short stature corn, shorter corn plant architecture, which for Stine always seemed like that was really just a means to an end, right? I mean, in our case, the focus was on higher population, being able to increase population, and along with that tended to come shorter plant architecture.
Right.
Do you think those are two sides of the same coin, or is short corn, can it be a totally separate thing from higher population corn?
That's a very, very good question. We would tell you that, first of all, we don't care what the plant height is. So we have not purposely went out and said, okay, we want short corn. Our breeding program and our selection process has brought that to us. And I would also tell you that we've been tracking our plant heights, and believe it or not, they've stopped getting shorter. So I would tell you that at one time we thought, okay, you wanted them to be shorter and shorter, and we actually did some things. We brought some germplasm in that was very, very short and made thousands of hybrids with that. It was a failure. Those products did not do well. We know you're just not going to have short corn. It's more complicated than that. We just know that right now we have a batch of material, a large batch of material that's shorter than what the industry has out there, and it performs. And it's taken us years to get it there. So we just know that's what we have, and that happens to be a characteristic that we ended up with. But I don't believe it'll continue to get shorter at this point.
So there is probably a realistic end to how short the corn plant can be.
All right.
I know one thing that, I think comes up in that conversation when growers talk about plant height is ear placement. When we talk about shorter corn, that becomes a topic of concern, and I know you've talked a little bit about that in the past. Let's just talk about architecture and what it takes to have shorter corn that's productive.
So ear placement's huge. That's harvestability, and we track that. That's another criteria, frankly, that we use. And all of our material, our ear placement, has moved up the plant relative to the plant height. And so we don't have an ear placement issue. Now, we have heard from our competitors that is a struggle that they have. They have a hard time having preferable ear placement that gives good harvestability. And I would tell you that we don't have that issue because we've been doing this since the mid-'90s. So we have more than 30 years of multiple generations of selection to assure that we have a good ear placement.
In talking to our corn breeding team, there were a couple things that I thought were interesting with regard to ear placement. Was one being when corn plants are very tall, high ear placement becomes a problem because now you have a very high center of gravity, right, for that plant. Mm-hmm. So corn breeders, I think, for a long, long time, were working to move ear placement down.
Yep.
Lower on the plant, which then could start to work against you as you start to try to shorten up the plant. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is, I suppose, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, if the plant's goal is to, pollinate that ear, having that ear placement closer to the tassels just probably is a logical, it's probably where the corn plant wants to be, right?
Yeah, we've theorized that. You would think the fact that a lot of these newer genetics that we have smaller tassels, because it really doesn't take a large tassel to pollinate, that it makes sense, that plant naturally wants to move that ear closer to the tassel so it pollinates more easily. That would make sense. We don't know if that's what's happening, but we know that's what we're getting. We're getting short plants, the ear placement's going up, and in fact, the ear placement's wonderful. It's typically just ideal for good harvestability, and that's causing that ear to be closer to the tassel.
So we talked about ear placement, and just to review, and when we talk about these plants with, this different plant architecture, what are some of the other things that we, typically see characteristically the different plant architecture with high density or shorter stature corn?
Yeah, so you have shorter nodes. You have the same number of leaves. Your upper leaves are typically more upright leaves. And we think that happens because, you're trying to create, a plant that does a better job of harvesting sunlight, and more upright leaves do a better job of that. We also see the tassel being below the leaves, because if the tassel's above the leaves, that tassel's blocking sun to some of the leaf material on that plant, and it's not as efficient, or it's just not able to gather as much sun. So we're seeing the tassel get smaller and the tassel go down below the leaves, and once again get closer to the ear.
And that's something that you see, particularly with our material. You definitely see, as you travel around in the summer, you'll see green leaves up in the top canopy, up in the space where, historically you might have just seen tassels.
All right.
across that field. So, which again, if they're trying to capture light, that's where you want those leaves to be. So we talked about the fact we've been on this road for a long, long time, 3 decades, working toward this change in plant architecture. I guess, what advantages do you think our past experience gives us over the rest of the industry who's just now coming to this?
Well, the big thing is our germplasm bank of material is highly refined. And so it's already shorter, it stands, has good ear placement, it performs, it yields. That's probably going to be the biggest factor is, as these other companies get into it, they're adding a variable. They're trying to find shorter plant types, and will they have the performance? Will they have the yield? Our program was selecting for yield. So the yield came first, then came the shorter plant architecture and so on and so forth. So our advantage will be we're just ahead of everybody by multiple generations. You could argue, we're probably ahead of everybody by 50 or 60 generations based on our winter nursery work and so on and so forth. And that's a big deal. It's hard to catch up to that. And so we're going to have more yield, and then we're going to have better agronomic characteristics with our hybrids.
That was another thing I was going to ask. Over the decades, we've tried a lot of different things. We've been through a lot of variations on this concept, always going toward increasing yield. But as we move toward this change in plant architecture, what do you think are things that maybe we've learned along the way that some of these companies are going to only begin to learn now as they are starting down the path we were on 30 years ago?
Well, I'll tell you the big thing is when you're working with a customer base with shorter stature material, shading effect is a huge factor. People tend to not understand shading effect. And farmers love to do their own tests on their farm. Like a split planter test, for instance. Half the planter is the shorter hybrid, half the planter is a conventional hybrid they've been using. Well, what happens is that taller hybrid, that conventional taller hybrid, will shade out that shorter plant type. They get their data in the fall and they go, well, that short corn didn't yield. Well, that's because the taller plant type shaded out a portion of the shorter plant type's rows. So that's a struggle. So people have to know how to evaluate these hybrids on their farm without shading effect becoming a factor. And sometimes you could talk to some people till you're blue in the face and they say, yes, I get it. And then they do something, and within their evaluation on their farm, they have not eliminated shading effect, and they're getting bad data and they're making bad decisions on that.
And when you say bad data, I mean, the error factor can be really significant, am I right?
It can be huge. We have test after test in our research department, and then our field reps do test after test that show, like a 6-inch difference in plant height can cause the first 2 to 3 rows by that taller plant to be off by 40 bushel. Well, that's significant. That throws everything off. So people need to really evaluate these things and eliminate that shading effect by having large enough tracks where they're able to take the middle of the track out, or split a field or do something so you don't have shading effect.
So the best approach is probably split a field and then avoid the several neighboring rows, taking that data separately, right? So that you really are just taking the shorter stature corn separate from the taller corn and avoiding those middle rows where the impact would be more pronounced.
That's right. Where those rows touch, where the short hybrid touches the tall hybrid, the tall hybrid's going to be harvesting more sunlight than the short hybrid and make the short hybrid look worse. So you just have to eliminate that and say that's not there.
Well, and I assume that same theory would hold true for even seed companies who may be doing 1-row plots or 2-row plots when they're evaluating material. And I don't know if anybody does that anymore, but I think for a long time that was a factor even in the breeding programs of a lot of seed companies, right?
Oh, that's right. Yeah. in our own company, we've had to do a number of things to eliminate shading effect as a factor when we're doing an analysis of our data. And it's difficult because as a breeding entity, your objective is to get the best data you can with as few plots and as little seed as possible. And so that's hard. You don't want to have enormous plots because you're looking at hundreds of thousands of hybrids, and you just can't afford to have these enormous plots that you can't plant 8 rows and harvest the middle 2 rows to know that you don't have shading effect as a factor. And then you have alleyways in your strip trials and things like that to consider. David, another factor, the number one thing is shading effect. And then on these shorter hybrids, many of them need higher populations because they're shorter. They're shorter, you have less biomass, but what you're trying to do is essentially have the same amount of biomass on that acre, but each plant has less biomass, and you're trying to raise your yield. Well, people won't use the right populations. I mean, they won't raise those populations to what they need to be. And that's a huge factor also in understanding how this shorter stature material works.
And what do you think the hurdle there is? Is it just tradition, or is it past experience where maybe they've taken a hybrid that wasn't adapted and seen where pushing that population had a negative impact on the crop, and so now they're a little gun shy? I mean, what are your thoughts? Yeah,
I think it's the last thing you said there. I think they have taken a conventional hybrid before, cranked the population up, and then had it fall down flat, which can happen. And the shorter stature material won't do that. And so if I was a farmer and, here's a new technology coming out, and I've done this before with my older style hybrids, I'd be hesitant to do it also. But I think the big thing, that's a factor, but a big thing is we all take the path of least resistance. So we go out to our farm. Many growers, either have a script done ahead of time, and they may not take the time to make sure that specific hybrid gets the right population because they may treat all their hybrids the same. And maybe that's worked for them in the past, but now they can't do that. So it's a change, and it's an added management point. And sometimes that's tough. It's tough to get that worked into the whole program.
Yeah, and that's a good point because, you've got, in many cases, all winter long to make the best plan you have, but, sometimes spring is not very forgiving. And when the gun goes off, sometimes plans have to change, and that may be a reason why it's difficult to adapt to some of these new processes, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I guess it occurs to me that on our journey as we talk about short stature corn, we have been historically focused less on plant height, and you said that earlier, and more about population. Of the two, which of those do you think is more important? Because we're talking about shorter corn so that we can increase the population, and I think some folks talking about shorter corn so it doesn't blow over, for example. Which is more important of those?
Population. Yeah, I would tell you at the end of the day, that's the low-hanging fruit for many growers. More plants per acre will make more yield. We have hybrids that maybe you may consider them short statured, maybe not, but they still need more plants per acre. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to make yield.
And you brought up a good point there. Short stature and high pop are not necessarily linked entirely. They tend to run in the same circles, but we do have hybrids that are taller relative to Stine that we still consider to be higher population and how they handle population, right?
Right, correct.
So where do you think, like I said, right now this conversation is happening a lot. We're seeing a lot of things in the farm magazines, and I think as we travel around, we've seen a lot more conversation with growers inquiring about shorter stature corn. Where do you see this going? Do you think that this is just going to, really explode now, or are we just only at the beginning of this?
So we're known as a soybean company, not as a corn company. However, we're doing some very amazing things in corn. Some of our competitors, they have great corn programs. They have great breeding programs. I think it's really wonderful to see them in this area of shorter stature corn. I think some of them will do a nice job of talking about it, and frankly, they have a wider footprint than we have, and they can talk to more people than we talk to. So I think it will, without a doubt, help the movement of shorter stature corn into the industry. It will help growers understand how they use these products. So I think it opens the door for Stine as a corn company to bring this technology to more growers and have more growers accept it.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, it's kind of adding more voices to the conversation. And I think what we've said all along is, this is an industry movement, or should be. And so I think what you're saying is having more people talking about it, more companies talking about it, forces that conversation in a way that probably we ourselves were not able to move along as quickly.
Correct. I've been even so we sell in Europe, and I was in France with some growers in France, and we have our conventional material over there, which is doing very well. And they have interest in shorter stature corn. We sell in Latin America. Even customers in Brazil and Argentina are wanting to talk about shorter stature corn. I mean, the whole world is going this direction. And it's a wonderful thing. And I think it's going to be one of the main factors that enables the world to up its corn production significantly.
Well, that's exciting, and it's exciting that we've had the leadership position to be able to kind of lead this along, and now all these conversations taking place. It seems like it's finally coming to pass. Well, thank you, Myron. We've been visiting Myron Stine about short stature corn and the movement within the industry and Stine's position, and glad to have you on the show today. We appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, David.
That's our time for today. I want to thank our guests and listeners for joining us on another episode of the Stine Seedcast. We'll be back again soon with more expert interviews and insights about all things Stine. And to never miss an episode, subscribe to the Stine Seedcast wherever podcasts are found.
Subscribe to the Stine Seedcast wherever podcasts are found. To learn more about Stine and its elite corn and soybean genetics, visit stineseed.com. Stine has yield.